In the latter part of the 15th century, England displayed a growing sense of aspiration as it gazed over the wide Atlantic Ocean. Portugal and Spain had already made significant progress in colonizing the New World, and England felt that it was falling further and further behind. The expansion of their empire, the discovery of new resources, and the establishment of trade routes were all goals that they desired to achieve by gaining a presence in the Americas. The call went out for guys who were courageous and ambitious to take the initiative and lead the charge. Sir Walter Raleigh was one of the individuals who responded to him. He was more than just an explorer, he was also a writer, a soldier, and a courtier during the Elizabethan age. He was a great figure. In essence, he was granted a permit that provided him with a deadline, and he was successful in obtaining a charter from Queen Elizabeth I herself. It was stated that he had until the year 1591 to successfully establish a colony in the Americas. The right to colonize would be taken away from him if he was unsuccessful by that time. As a result, the clock was beginning to tick. Sir Walter Raleigh wasted little time in initiating the process of collection of finances and the formation of a group. The first thing he did was plan his initial move, which included looking at maps and consulting with sailors. Initially, this was not supposed to be a full-scale invasion of the territory. He came to the conclusion that the next best move would be to dispatch a small reconnaissance mission first. A scouting expedition was sent out to investigate the situation, choose a suitable location, and learn about the competition they faced. In 1584, he was prepared to go. From England, 2 tiny ships set sail in the direction of the undiscovered coastline of the region that is now commonly known as North Carolina. They arrived on land in the region that is commonly referred to as the Outer Banks, which is a chain of barrier islands. As they entered this unfamiliar territory, the men on board were wary since they did not know what to anticipate. However, what they discovered had beyond all of their expectations. They rapidly came into contact with the Native American tribes that lived in the area, and rather than being treated with animosity, they were greeted with interest and friendship. The natives of the area extended a warm welcome to the Englishmen and even extended an invitation to visit their primary settlement. A nearby island known as Roanoke was the location of this village, which was situated on the island. For the English scouts, this was the ideal beginning to their journey. They were brought to Roanoke Island, where they were able to coexist peacefully with the indigenous people who lived there already. Not only did they study from them, but they also traded with them. The indigenous instructed the English on how to fish and hunt in this new habitat, as well as how to locate food and how to survive this new environment. A wonderful interchange of cultural experiences and information took place. Excitement was felt by the Englishmen. This location, Roanoke, appeared to be perfect. It was a protected location, the locals were warm and welcoming, and the land was rich in fertility. Following the completion of this fruitful scouting operation, the company set sail for England after a period of 1 month. They were abuzz with the news of excellent things. Immediately, they hurried to Sir Walter Raleigh and informed him of everything that had happened. In their description, they talked of the welcoming people, the land that held great potential, and the possibility of a prosperous English settlement. Raleigh had no doubts about it. This was the end. Yes, this was the location. As soon as he arrived, he started making preparations for a far larger and more comprehensive colonization movement. Through the accumulation of ships, supplies, and troops, he invested all of his resources in it. He was resolute in his commitment to accomplish his goal and embed the English flag firmly in the soil of the United States. After a year had passed, in the year 1585, the actual mission was initiated. The scouting crew was not particularly small. 7 ships, each carrying 600 soldiers, were dispatched by Sir Walter Raleigh as part of his fleet. In addition to being explorers, these individuals were both soldiers and settlers. In addition to that, they contained sufficient supplies to last this entire group for an entire year. The establishment of a permanent English presence was a significant endeavor that required a significant amount of work. The trip across the Atlantic was lengthy but unremarkable in spite of its length. At first glance, it appeared like everything was proceeding exactly as planned. While they were getting closer to the coast of North Carolina, the atmosphere was upbeat and positive. In a moment, they were going to make history. After that, however, calamity struck. The flagship of the fleet, which was the largest and most important ship in the fleet, ran aground while the fleet was navigating the treacherous waters of the Outer Banks. The majority of their necessary supplies were being transported by this particular vessel. They had everything they required to survive the first year on the ship, including crates of food, barrels of fresh water, tools, and seeds for planting that they needed to survive. The impact was significant when it made contact with the sandbar. As a result of the hole in the hull, the cargo hold was flooded with seawater. A significant percentage of their food supply was rendered unusable as a result of the saltwater, and it was destroyed beyond repair. Before they had even set foot in their new house, they were dealt a blow that was equally heartbreaking. It was necessary for the leaders of the expedition to make a difficult decision. They were immediately aware of the fact that they were unable to provide for all 600 men with the resources that they still had available. Simply put, there was not enough food to go around anymore. In light of this, a challenging choice was taken. As a result, 500 of the men would be required to go back. Through the use of the surviving ships, they would make their way back to England, leaving behind a skeleton crew consisting of only 100 men to build the colony. This was a significant setback, but they remained resolute in their commitment to move forward. Following this, the 100 men who had been selected to remain were transported to Roanoke Island via ferry. They brought along with them the little goods that they had been able to save. They started by looking for the nearby Native American tribes, the same ones who had been so welcoming to the scouting party a year earlier. This was the first thing that they did. It is a blessing that those positive relationships remained. The settlers began by providing an explanation of their predicament and requesting authorization to establish their colony on the island. After receiving approval from the chief of the community, the 100 Englishmen started the laborious process of constructing their new dwellings. They constructed a fort and a few modest homes, and for a period of time, everything appeared to be going according to plan. In addition to assisting the immigrants in adjusting to their new world, the indigenous tribes were extremely helpful in sharing their food. In spite of this, the Englishmen were aware that their situation was uncertain. The resources that they had were not even close to being sufficient to last them through the upcoming winter. The 500 soldiers who had returned to England had made a commitment to send a resupply ship which was anticipated to arrive before the onset of winter. Every one of the 100 settlers was counting on it. After each passing day, they kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, anticipating the sight of English sails. However, as the days turned into weeks and the temperature continued to drop, their supplies were decreasing to the point that they were practically gone. Just for the purpose of sustenance, they became wholly reliant on the generosity of the indigenous communities. Something that they were unaware of was the fact that the resupply mission had been called off. Upon her return to England, Queen Elizabeth made the decision that the ongoing war effort at home required the utilization of every ship that was available. Quite simply, the small colony that was located in Roanoke was not a priority. Therefore, there would be no assistance arriving. The connection between the settlers and the Native Americans began to show signs of strain as the whites' desperation increased. In addition to the fact that the persistent demand for food was turning into a hardship, the initial goodwill began to evaporate. There was an increase in tension. Both the English governor and the tribal chief, who were in charge of the two groups, began to develop a sense of mistrust toward one another. In response to the mounting tension, the indigenous people made the decision to pursue a peaceful resolution. It would be as simple as leaving. They had the intention of putting Roanoke Island and all of its riches totally in the hands of the English immigrants, and they planned to leave the island and travel to the mainland. They had high hopes that this would resolve the issue and prevent any potential conflict. However, the English colonists had a totally different perspective on this shift. They had developed paranoia as a result of their helplessness. The retreat was not intended to be a peace offering in their eyes. Rather than that, they grew to believe that the indigenous people were heading to the mainland in order to assemble warriors from various tribes, to build a big war party, and then to return in order to eradicate the 100 Englishmen for good. It is not possible to establish that this was the Indians' intention. However, the English colonists, who were terrified, came to the conclusion that they had to take the initiative first. As a result of their paranoia, they decided to carry out a preemptive strike. They traveled across the ocean to the mainland and launched an assault on the very village that was home to the people who had been keeping them alive for several months. The unexpected assault was both severe and instantaneous. A tribe that had been their ally in the past was completely eradicated by them. The time had come for the settlers to return to Roanoke Island, but their predicament had become much more dire. In addition to the fact that they were without supplies and had no idea how to survive the winter on their own, they had also created a hostile environment for the people who lived in the surrounding area. They were shut off from the rest of the world and afraid. During this time period, a fleet of English ships led by the renowned Sir Francis Drake was making its way back to England from the Caribbean. This was a mere happenstance that occurred around this time. When Drake was in Roanoke, he made a trip to check on the colony. The 100 settlers were in a state of complete and utter fear when he arrived. In addition to the fact that they had just perpetrated a slaughter, they were starving, and they were certain that they would ultimately be punished. They pleaded with Drake to take them back together. They desired to leave. A nightmare had emerged in place of the fantasy of starting a fresh life in the United States. They were in such a hurry to leave the colony that the evacuation was a complete mayhem. 97 of the soldiers were successful in boarding Drake's ships, but those were the only ones. Because they were in such a rush, they left 3 of their own men behind. This was due to the fact that they were not present at the settlement when the ships were ready to go. They simply sailed away, leaving those 3 men to fend for themselves in complete isolation. A few days after this rushed escape, the resupply ship that Sir Walter Raleigh had dispatched finally arrived. This was a bitter twist of irony that occurred just a few days after the rapid evacuation. Even though it was late, it had arrived. It was discovered by the crew of the resupply ship that the Roanoke colony had been utterly deserted. In spite of the fact that the houses and the fort were present, there were no people present. During their investigation of the island, they did not discover any trace of the 3 men who had been left behind, nor did they locate any indication of the 97 men who had just left. Given that the ship's captain was befuddled and that there was no one to whom the supplies were to be delivered, he just turned around and sailed back to England. After a couple of weeks had passed, yet another English ship made a halt in Roanoke. This was a distinct company, and they were also traveling back to England at the time. The town was found to be deserted by them as well. This particular captain, however, was of the opinion that the colony, which was still in a respectable condition, should not be completely abandoned. In the end, it was an outpost on the English side. As a result, he made the decision to abandon a small garrison consisting of 15 members of his own crew there. It was their responsibility to keep the fort under control, to watch over the outpost, and to ensure that there was a consistent English presence on the island until a fresh set of colonists could be dispatched. Therefore, these 15 men were abandoned on the island, and the ship sailed away, leaving them to fend for themselves on the tranquil and deserted environment. Back in England, a man by the name of John White was one of the individuals who had been a member of the initial colony that had been unsuccessful. Despite the fact that his initial attempt at conquering America was a failure, he continued to be enthusiastic about the concept of doing so. He was both an artist and a mapmaker. He was still holding out hope for the dream. He succeeded in persuading Sir Walter Raleigh to provide financial support for one more trip. However, they would approach things in a new manner this time. White contended that the initial attempt was unsuccessful due to the fact that it was excessively menacing. Simply put, there were only 600 soldiers in the group. A fresh strategy was suggested by him. Families would make up the members of this new colony, which would be a true community. As a means of establishing a new life and a decent settlement, men, women, and children would travel there. Raleigh was in agreement. Additionally, he concurred with White's recommendation that they should make no attempt to return to Roanoke. It felt as though the location was cursed, and it was clear that the local relationships had been ruined. Instead, they decided to focus their attention on the Chesapeake Bay, which was located further to the north and was regarded as a more fruitful and militarily advantageous region. It was in the year 1587 that a new fleet consisting of 3 ships set out from England. The position of governor of this newly established colony was given to John White. White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband were among the approximately 115 colonists who were allowed to board the ship. They were going to cruise to the Chesapeake Bay, that much was certain. Nevertheless, they had the intention of making a little stop in Roanoke while they were on their way. It was necessary for them to retrieve the 15 soldiers who had been entrusted with the responsibility of guarding the fort. They would provide them with new supplies and then transport them to the new colony that was established in the Chesapeake region. On the other hand, a really peculiar occurrence had place during the trip. Another individual by the name of Simon Fernandez served as the fleet's main navigator. He was a Portuguese pilot with a great deal of experience who had participated in all of the excursions that had been made to Roanoke before. His crew held him in the highest regard, possibly even more so than John White, the governor, who was also widely respected. He had a magnetic personality, and the sailors had complete faith in his moral superiority. In the event that the fleet arrived at Roanoke, Simon Fernandez declined to proceed any further for reasons that have never been completely explained. Fernandez made a statement that essentially stated that this was the end of the line after they had dispatched a small crew to the shore in order to search for the 15 soldiers. All of the colonists were instructed to disembark from the ships. It was said by him that he would not be transporting them to the Chesapeake Bay. In Roanoke, they were going to re-establish the colony that had been established. In spite of his best efforts, John White, the formal governor, was unable to stop him. He was aware that Fernandez wielded the trust and devotion of the team. If he attempted to disagree, he would most likely be met with a rebellion. As a result, the 115 colonists, including men, women, and children, watched with heavy hearts as their goods were dumped into the shores of the one location that they had specifically planned to avoid. Their hope of beginning a new life in the Chesapeake region was dashed before it even got off the ground. They were in the process of establishing their new life, and the first thing they needed to do was locate the 15 men who were meant to be protecting the old fort. However, upon arriving in the settlement, they discovered that there was no trace of them. An eerie silence pervaded the fort, which was devoid of any inhabitants. A single human skeleton, which had been picked clean and was lying in the grass, was the only object that they discovered. John White hypothesized that the native tribes had most likely assaulted and killed the men in order to exact their vengeance for the carnage that had been committed by the English immigrants who had arrived to the area previously. It was until a few days later that his concerns were proven to be correct. One of the colonists, a man called George Howe, was fishing by himself in a creek that was located some distance away from the main community. He was suddenly confronted by a gang of Native Americans who had ambushed him. To put an end to his life, they used 16 arrows to shoot him. The new colonists received a message that was both unambiguous and harsh. You are not tolerated in this place. It had not been forgotten that there had been brutality in the past. Terrified were the newly arrived settlers. To begin, this was a terrible beginning. They had the impression that they were quite unprepared and exposed. Not only were their supplies already restricted, but they were also in a hostile region, and the objective that they had hoped to reach had been taken away from them. All of the colonists arrived at John White's house together. They informed him that the colony would perish if they did not receive additional assistance. More people, more food, more tools, and more weapons were all things that they required. They begged with him to return to England and bring back supplies and reinforcements before he could accept their request. John White was in a state of conflict. He was adamant about not leaving. In an effort to establish a new planet, he had recently introduced his family, which included his pregnant daughter, to the other side of the Atlantic. There was a sense of abandonment in leaving them now. When he returned to England, he was concerned that people would view him as a coward who fled at the first sight of conflict. He was afraid that this would be the case. The colonists, however, were adamant. They were under the impression that he was the only person who could possibly successfully defend their case in England and obtain the assistance that they so sorely required. Later on, he gave his consent. A fortunate coincidence was that Simon Fernandez and his ships had not yet departed the region at the time of the event. They had established themselves in the Outer Banks and were getting ready to embark on their voyage back. In light of this, John White had to say a tough farewell to his family. Eleanor, his daughter, had just given birth to a baby girl who was named Virginia Dare. She was the first English child to be born in the Americas. It was then that he boarded Fernandez's ship and sailed sail for England, having already assured them that he would return as soon as he was able to do so. However, upon his return to England, he was confronted with a devastating piece of information. A full-scale war between England and Spain was on the verge of breaking out. The vast Spanish Armada was getting ready to attack, and Queen Elizabeth had issued an order that every single ship in England that was physically capable of carrying out its duties was to be taken over for the purpose of contributing to the war effort. It was forbidden for any ships, whether they were commercial or civilian, to leave English ports. All of them were required in order to protect the realm. John White was unable to escape. In an effort to come back to his family and his colony, he made frantic efforts to acquire a ship, to acquire supplies, but it was difficult for him to do so. The conflict with Spain stretched on for a long time, and he was unable to carry out any of his requests. It took him a year, then 2 years, and then 3 years to complete a voyage that he had anticipated would take only a few months. John White was unable to leave England for 3 long years, and he was plagued by the thought of his family and the 115 colonists he had abandoned who were waiting for him on that harsh island across the water. In the year 1590, the conflict with Spain was finally brought to an end, and the shipping lanes were once again open. John White, with the assistance of Sir Walter Raleigh, was successful in securing passage on a group of privateering ships that were en route to the Americas. It was decided upon that they would transport him together with his provisions and deliver him to Roanoke. There had been 3 years of excruciating pain, but he was finally on his way back. While the ships were getting closer to the Outer Banks, White's heart must have been beating extremely fast. After that, he boarded a smaller boat that was accompanied by a landing party in order to complete the trek to Roanoke Island. During the time that they were rowing approaching the coast, they started shouting and calling out in the hopes of receiving a response from the colonists. The sound of the wind and the waves was the only thing that could provide an answer. As soon as they touched down on the island's northern shore, they instantly became aware of something that was troubling. On the beach and leading into the trees, there were fresh footprints in the sand that went in both directions. However, nobody was going to come and greet them. The spacecraft would have been visible to the colonists if they had been present with them. Upon seeing the rescue team that had been waiting for a very long time, they would have been happy and rushed to the beach. The lack of sound was a serious warning indicator. The tracks indicated that someone had not been here for a while. What was the reason for their concealment if it was an English settler? Furthermore, if it was a Native American, their silence was far more ominous than it already was. It was John White who led the landing party as they slowly made their way inland in the direction of the location where the colony would be established. They were walking through the forest when they came across something that had been carved into a tree. Only 3 letters were involved: C-R-O. That was it. The feeling of dread that they were experiencing increased with each step that they took. Despite the fact that they continued to yell and cry out names, there was no change in the silence. Finally, they were able to break through the tree line and arrive at the clearing that had formerly been the location of the settlement. However, it was not in the same state that he had left it in. A little village consisting of homes that was undefended has vanished. There was a powerful fortress that stood in its place. The area where the homes had been located was now completely surrounded by a palisade, which was a wall constructed of thick wooden pikes and was tall and solid. This was something fresh. Evidently, the colonists had constructed it for the sake of protection after he had left. He then became aware of it. There was only one word carved onto one of the huge wooden posts that stood at the entryway to this brand new fort, and that word was Croatoan. Following their approach, the party proceeded to enter through the gate. The entire interior was a vision of complete and utter despair. Clearly, there had been no one living there for a considerable amount of time. There was an excessive amount of grass and weeds. Each and every one of the homes and structures that were located within the palisade had been destroyed and removed, without a single thing remaining. All of the valuable items, including tools, furniture, clothing, and personal possessions, were taken away during the incident. Heavy objects that would have been too difficult to transfer, such as some iron bars and pieces of lead, were the only things that remained after everything else had been removed. There were no indications of a battle, however. Neither human remains nor skeletons were found, nor were there any indications of a conflict or a fire. It appeared as though the 115 individuals, including men, women, and children, had meticulously gathered any and all belongings they possessed, destroyed their homes, and then just disappeared into thin air. John White, upon observing this, stated in his writings that he was not truly immediately concerned about the situation. As a matter of fact, he felt a sense of relief. The reason for this is that the phrases that he saw etched into the tree and the post came across to him as more than simply random gibberish. They were a message, a pre-arranged code that he had established with the colonists before he left 3 years earlier. He took responsibility for setting it up. He had explained to them, look, if you run into trouble and you have to abandon Roanoke for any reason, I need to be able to find you when I get back. So, you need to leave me a sign. Carve the name of your destination into a tree or a post. If you are leaving by choice and everything is okay, just write the name. But if you are being forced to leave, if you're in distress, I want you to carve the destination name and then add a Maltese cross above it. After noticing that the word Croatoan did not contain a cross, John White interpreted this as a positive omen. It indicated that the colonists had voluntarily parted ways and were now safe. The name Croatoan was given to an island that was located around 50 miles to the south of Roanoke. There was also a group of Native Americans known as the Croatoan tribe, which was commanded by a chief named Monteo. Monteo was known to be a loyal friend and ally of the English. This tribe called this place home. According to White, the mystery appeared to be solved. Rather than fleeing to a more secure location, his people had simply relocated to Croatoan Island, where they were welcomed by the locals. However, there was one fact that stood out to him in his own notes that was a little bit peculiar. He claimed that the colonists had been discussing the possibility of migrating before to his departure in the year 1587. But they did not intend to travel 50 miles south to another island as part of their strategy. Their intention was to relocate to the mainland, which was located 50 miles to the north. In their opinion, an island was too secluded and defenseless to protect. Why, therefore, would they decide to change their minds and travel to another island that is even more remote? In spite of the fact that it did not entirely make sense, it was the only lead he had at the moment. The soldiers that John White had gathered together made a hasty retreat back to the ship. He couldn't wait to get back to his daughter and granddaughter on Croatoan Island, where he would be able to reconnect with them. Upon boarding the main ship, they raised the sails and started heading in the direction of the south. But just as they were deciding what path to choose, fate once again stepped in and changed everything. When they were attempting to weigh anchor, a violent storm began to sweep in, and at the same time, the enormous anchor line broke. At this point, the ship was completely dependent on the wind and the waves, which were driving them in the direction of the north, away from Croatoan. As the storm continued to worsen, the captain of the ship eventually informed White that it was impossible for them to successfully complete the mission. Due to the hazardous nature of the weather, they were unable to take the risk of traveling south to reach the island. They were required to go back to England. John White must have been in utter disbelief. He had come so close, but a storm and a damaged rope had prevented him from reaching his destination. He was never given the opportunity to travel to Croatoan. Indeed, he would never go back to the United States of America again. His death occurred in England a few years later, and he was never able to find out for certain what had transpired with his family and the Roanoke colony that had been lost. The story was considered to have come to an end there for centuries. The cliffhanger was really aggravating and enormous. One of the most widely held beliefs was that the colonists had relocated to Croatoan, where they had integrated themselves with the native population and lived out the rest of their lives. Various other hypotheses proposed that they were either annihilated by a hostile tribe, or that they attempted to sail back to England but became disoriented while at sea. On the other hand, there was no evidence. This was nothing more than conjecture. Following that, in the 1930s, a peculiar relic was discovered. A man was out strolling in North Carolina when he came upon a little stone that was smooth and had lettering carved into it. The stone was located approximately 50 miles north of Roanoke. He handed it over to a museum, and researchers in the field of history were astounded by what it appeared to convey. It was implied that Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, was the sender of the letter that was written down. It was a gloomy tale to tell. There was a report that stated that the colony had been invaded by hostile locals not long after White had left. The assault resulted in the deaths of 50% of the colonists. The people who managed to escape, including Eleanor, were seized hold of. A desperate tone was used to conclude the messages, which stated that just a small number of them were still alive, and that they did not anticipate living for a significant amount of time. It was a sensation that this stone, which eventually became known as the Dare Stone, was. As a result, a lot of individuals were doubtful. An important question to ask is why it was discovered 50 miles north of Roanoke. The Croatoan carving was the only piece of evidence that pointed southwest. It was highly illogical for the stone to be located in such a great distance in the opposite way. For this reason, the majority of historians disregarded the Dare Stone as a cunning and intricate fake for a number of decades. There was only one word that could unlock the mystery of Roanoke, and that word was Croatoan. Then, in 2011, everything underwent a transformation. The maps that John White had been responsible for creating were being analyzed by a group of researchers. In his capacity as an accomplished artist and geographer, he had created comprehensive maps of the coasts of Virginia and North Carolina. At that time, it was normal practice for mapmakers to make adjustments by pasting a small patch of new paper or canvas over a mistake on the map. This was done in order to clarify the situation. When you look at historical maps from the 1500s, you will frequently notice that there are these small patches scattered all over the place. A few of them were included in John White's maps. For ages, nobody had given them much thought on anyone's part. It was just presumed that they were very small adjustments. However, in 2011, a researcher came up with an outstanding concept. Imagine for a moment that these weren't merely tweaks. Imagine for a moment that anything was being concealed on purpose. By employing cutting-edge imaging techniques such as X-rays and infrared light, they made the decision to investigate the areas beneath these patches. When they looked at one of White's maps, they discovered something quite remarkable. Approximately 50 miles to the north of Roanoke Island, there was a patch that covered a particular piece of land which was located along the Chowan River. It was precisely the same location where the Dare Stone had been discovered. In addition, when scientists surveyed the area beneath that patch, they discovered a pattern. A star with 4 points drawn in red and blue was sketched on the paper. During that period of time, that symbol was used to depict a fort in the cartography. From the appearance of things, it appeared as though John White had created a hidden English fort on his map, and then he had purposefully concealed it. However, the discovery became much more peculiar. In the process of examining the patch itself, which consisted of a piece of paper that had been adhered to the surface, they discovered even another secret. There was a person who had drawn the exact same fort symbol on the patch, but they had used invisible ink to draw it. Only in the presence of a particular light could it be seen. The situation was reminiscent of something from a spy thriller. It offered the possibility of a double blind, a secret that was concealed beneath another secret. The location of this fort is thought to have been classified information according to the idea. They were especially concerned about it falling into the wrong hands, such as those of the Spanish, with whom they had just finished a battle. Therefore, they concealed the obvious symbol. Nevertheless, the invisible ink symbol that was placed on top would provide confirmation of the position for someone who was aware of what they were looking for. They began referring to this undisclosed location as Site X by the researchers. In addition, the fact that it existed shattered the entire Roanoke investigation. All of a sudden, the Dare Stone did not appear to be a hoax anymore. In addition, John White's own forgotten memo, in which he stated that the colonists had initially intended to move 50 miles north to the mainland, suddenly appeared to be of the utmost significance. What would have happened if they had remained true to their initial strategy throughout the entire process? What if the carving that read Crow-O-An was a purposeful attempt to mislead a red herring that was supposed to lead anyone who was looking for them in the wrong direction, while the majority of the colonists were sneaking their way to their fortified and hidden settlement at Site X? As a result of this novel notion, a rush of work ensued. In spite of the fact that they have not yet discovered the ruins of a massive fort, archaeologists have arrived at the location that has been designated as Site X. They have discovered evidence that is persuasive. They have discovered fragments of English pottery, more precisely a form of pottery known as Surrey Hampshire borderware, as well as other metal objects that are consistent with an English settlement that existed close to the end of the 16th century. As of right now, the excavations and the study are still going on, and the specialists are trying to determine whether or not this is, in fact, the last destination of the colonists who went missing. However, even if Site X turns out to be the solution, this does not guarantee that the enigma will be solved. It merely raises a fresh set of questions that are eerie to consider. Could you please tell me what happened to them if they did move north? Have the events that transpired on the Dare Stone been exactly as they were written? they were annihilated as a result of an attack. And perhaps the question that has been bothering me the most of all is, why? Why was there such a complex trick with the carving of the word Croatoan? And how is it possible that with all the curiosity and all the seeking that has taken place over the course of more than 400 years, not a single definitive trace, not even a single bone from any of the 115 colonists has ever been recovered and positively identified? They just disappeared after walking into the jungles of the New World, leaving behind a mystery that is today the oldest in the history of the United States of America. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comment section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up? This is a story that has fascinated people for decades. It's one of those cases that, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't seem to make sense. In 1979, the New York Times called it one of the Western world's most convincing cases of reincarnation. Now, a lot of stories about past lives are hard to verify. There's usually no real proof you can point to today. But this one is different. This is the story of a woman named Dorothy Eady, who later became known as Om Seti. And her life story and the things she claimed to remember from a past life led to real, verifiable, modern-day discoveries in Egypt. Things that professional Egyptologists and historians just couldn't explain. For decades, they tried to prove she was a fraud, that she was lying. And they never could. She knew things she just shouldn't have known. Things that make you stop and wonder, what if she was telling the truth? Our story begins in London in 1904. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family. She was an only child, and her parents absolutely adored her. Life was normal, quiet, and happy for the first 3 years. And then, one day, everything changed. Little 3-year-old Dorothy was playing in her home when she took a terrible fall down a flight of stairs. She was knocked completely unconscious. Her parents were frantic. They called for the family doctor, who rushed over to the house. He examined Dorothy, and after a few moments, he had to deliver the worst news imaginable. He turned to her parents and told them their daughter was dead. The next hour was just a blur of grief for her parents. The doctor was there, trying to console them, talking about what needed to happen next. They were in a state of total shock. But then, about an hour after the doctor had pronounced her dead, they heard something, a sound coming from Dorothy's bedroom. They went to check, and they could not believe their eyes. There was Dorothy, sitting up on her bed, playing as if nothing had happened. They rushed in, the doctor right behind them, and they were all just speechless. Dorothy seemed perfectly fine. Her parents, in their confusion and relief, turned on the doctor. They were furious, yelling at him for pronouncing her dead when she was clearly alive. But the doctor was adamant. He swore she had been gone. He had checked for a pulse, for breath. There was nothing. He had no medical explanation for what had just happened. In the days and weeks after the accident, Dorothy's parents noticed some changes. The biggest one was her voice. She started speaking with a strange accent, one they couldn't place at all. They took her to doctors and specialists who suggested she might be suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome. It's a real medical condition that can happen after a significant head injury, and it basically alters a person's speech patterns. To someone who doesn't know, it can sound like they suddenly have a foreign accent. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Dorothy also started talking about a recurring dream. She told her parents that every night she would dream of a huge building with massive pillars. And right next to this building was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. She would describe the flowers, the trees, the feeling of peace she had when she was there. It was like an oasis. She loved this garden more than anything. But in the dream, she didn't know where it was. And being just 3 or 4 years old, she had a hard time articulating exactly what she was seeing. All she knew was that she loved this place in her dreams, and she talked about it constantly. It got to the point where her mother would often find her crying in her bed, either before going to sleep or right after waking up. When her mother asked what was wrong, Dorothy would say she wanted to go home. Her mother would try to reassure her, saying, "But honey, you are home." And Dorothy would shake her head and insist, "No, I'm not. My home is there, in the garden." She was completely convinced that the place in her dreams was her real home, and nothing her parents said could change her mind. A little while later, when Dorothy was still very young, her parents decided to take her on a trip to the British Museum. The museum had a large exhibit on ancient Egypt. As they walked in, Dorothy spotted the Egyptian section from across the room. Her eyes went wide. She saw the towering statues of pharaohs, the pictures of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and then she just took off. She sprinted away from her parents, running straight into the exhibit. She ran up to the statues, these ancient stone figures, and started kissing their feet. She was sobbing, completely overcome with emotion, and yelling out loud, "I'm home! I'm home! I'm with my people!" This tiny little girl was having this huge emotional revelation right there in the middle of the museum. Her parents were mortified. People were staring, wondering what on earth was wrong with their child. They eventually managed to calm her down and get her to leave, but something had clicked into place for Dorothy. From that day forward, she knew. The beautiful garden from her dreams, the place she longed for, was in Egypt. Her newfound obsession with ancient Egypt started to cause problems. Her family was very devoutly Catholic, and they sent her to Sunday school. But Dorothy would constantly compare the teachings of Catholicism with what she knew about ancient Egyptian religions. This did not go over well. Eventually, the church told her she couldn't come to Sunday school anymore. Then, she was expelled from her Catholic school. The reason was that she refused to sing certain hymns, specifically ones that she felt were disrespectful to the ancient Egyptians. She was even barred from attending Sunday Mass. By the age of 6, Dorothy, who was already a good reader and writer in English, became fascinated with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The moment she saw them, she said they felt familiar, but it was like a language she had forgotten how to read. When she was 7 years old, she was looking through a book one day when she saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Temple of Seti I, which is in a place called Abydos, Egypt. The picture showed the Grand Temple, and next to it were the crumbling remains of what looked like it might have once been a garden. As soon as Dorothy saw it, she pointed and said, "That's it. That's my home." She was absolutely certain. That temple in Abydos was where she was from. She looked closer at the picture, at the broken, tattered remains next to the temple walls. "That's the garden," she said. "But where are all the trees? Why does it look like this?" She couldn't understand that thousands of years had passed. In her mind, she was seeing her home, but it was ruined. The textbook also had a picture of the pharaoh the temple was named after, Seti I. When she saw the image of his very well-preserved mummy, she was once again overcome with emotion. She said she had known him. She remembered him personally. This incredible knowledge didn't go unnoticed. At age 10, she caught the attention of a world-renowned Egyptologist named A. Wallace Budge. He was so impressed by her passion and her strange familiarity with the subject that he offered to personally teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics. She picked it up almost instantly, as if she were just remembering something she already knew. As she got older, the dreams continued. But starting around age 14, a new one began. It was a nightmare. In this nightmare, she was trapped in a dark underground room. A high priest was there, interrogating her, demanding she answer his questions. When she refused, he had her beaten. This dream would haunt her for years. Fast forward to when Dorothy, now called Edie, was 27. She met an Egyptian man, and they fell in love. But it's also very likely she saw the marriage as a way to finally get to Egypt. She wanted to secure Egyptian residency. As soon as they were married, they moved. The moment their boat landed in Egypt, Edie was overwhelmed. She got down on her hands and knees, kissed the ground, and cried, saying over and over again, "I'm home. I'm finally home." She and her husband soon had a son, and in a move that surprised no one who knew her, they named him Seti. Once she was living in Egypt, Edie's experiences became even more intense. She claimed she started receiving nightly visits from a spiritual entity she called Hora. She believed Hora was the spirit of the pharaoh, Seti I. For about a year, these visits would happen almost every night. Her husband would wake up in the middle of the night to find her in a trance-like state. She would be sitting up, her eyes glazed over, frantically writing in a notebook, but she wasn't writing in English. She was writing page after page of perfect, intricate hieroglyphics. Her husband said he couldn't snap her out of it. It was like she was possessed, just writing and writing. Edie later explained that Hora was dictating her life story to her, the story of who she used to be. Over the course of that year, she filled over 70 pages with this story, all written in hieroglyphics. And the story went like this. Before she was Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Bentrashite, which means harp of joy. She had lived 3,000 years earlier during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a simple vegetable seller. Her mother died when Bentrashite was only 3 years old. Her father, unable to care for her on his own, placed her in the temple at Kom el Sultan, which was near Abydos. She was raised in the temple and eventually became a priestess. When she turned 12, she was given a choice. She could either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own, or she could stay and become a consecrated virgin, dedicating her life to the gods. Bentrashit chose to stay and took the vows. But a few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I. They fell in love and began a secret relationship. Soon after, she discovered she was pregnant. For a consecrated virgin priestess, this was a catastrophic transgression. The high priest of the temple found out and interrogated her fiercely, demanding to know the name of the father. This interrogation, she realized, was the scene from her recurring nightmare. He had her beaten when she refused to name Seti. Bentrashit knew that if the truth came out, it would cause a massive public scandal for the pharaoh, the man she loved. Unwilling to let that happen, she took her own life. This entire experience, the nightly trances, the obsessive writing of hieroglyphics, the bizarre story of a past life, was all too much for Edie's husband. He grew more and more disturbed by her behavior. In 1936, he filed for divorce. After the divorce, Dorothy and her young son, Seti, moved to a town near the Giza pyramids. It was around this time that she stopped going by Dorothy Edie. She adopted a new name, Seti, which in Arabic means Mother of Seti. She was fully embracing her new identity, one that was deeply connected to ancient Egypt. She soon took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, beginning a long and surprisingly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti dedicated her life to her work. She researched and wrote and drew, becoming an expert. Her primary focus, of course, was the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. She learned everything there was to know about its history, its architecture, and the people who lived and worked there 3,000 years ago. It was, after all, the place she believed had been her home. But incredibly, for all those years, she never actually went there. It wasn't until 1952, when she was almost 50 years old, that she finally got the chance to set foot in Abydos. A job transfer came up, and she jumped at the opportunity. In fact, she was so desperate to go that she even took a significant pay cut to get the position. The moment she walked into the temple grounds, she felt a profound sense of familiarity. The first thing she said was, "It's as if I've lived here before. She quickly set up an office for herself in one of the temple's rooms and spent nearly all of her time there working and just being in the space. She even developed a strange friendship with a wild cobra that lived on the grounds. She would feed it every day and the snake would just hang out with her. Nobody could make sense of it. Rumors flew around about this eccentric Englishwoman, but her contributions to Egyptology were so significant and so valuable that she earned the deep respect of her colleagues, even if they thought her personal beliefs were strange. But of all her accomplishments, Seti is most famous for what happened shortly after she arrived at the temple. She had been dreaming of that beautiful garden her entire life. She walked around the crumbling exterior of the temple, and then she pointed to a specific spot. She told the chief inspector of antiquities that if they dug right there, they would find the temple garden. The archaeologists were skeptical. There were no records, no texts, nothing to suggest a garden had ever been in that location. But Seti was so certain. She didn't just point to the spot, she described the entire layout. She told them where the pathways would be, what kinds of trees they would find, and where those trees were planted. To appease her, and probably to prove her wrong, they decided to dig. And they were stunned. They dug down, and there it was. A garden. Exactly where she said it would be. And as they excavated, they found that the layout, the root systems of the ancient trees, everything matched her descriptions perfectly. This was information she could not have possibly known. It wasn't written down anywhere. But that was just the beginning. She then told them to excavate on the north side of the temple. She said there was a secret, undiscovered tunnel that ran underneath the temple from that side. Again, the archaeologists were doubtful. But again, they dug. And sure enough, there was the tunnel. It was a major discovery, and only she knew about it. Her uncanny knowledge didn't stop at the temple. She also pointed researchers to a specific unexplored area in the Valley of the Kings, a famous burial ground for pharaohs. She told them they would find a long-forgotten tomb there. They searched where she indicated, and they found a tomb that had never been discovered before. Time and time again, she provided information that led to incredible finds. The other Egyptologists, the scientists and academics, they didn't want to believe her story about reincarnation. They wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a strange woman, maybe an elaborate and clever hoax. But they were faced with a problem they couldn't solve. They couldn't deny the results. She possessed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the Temple of Seti I and the surrounding area during the exact time frame she claimed to have lived there as Bentreshit. They simply could not explain how she knew what she knew. Right before she passed away at the age of 81, Seti shared one final secret. She said that deep beneath the Temple of Seti I, there is a secret chamber. And inside that chamber, there is another secret, a library of records or a hidden tomb, something of incredible importance. But she passed away before she could give more specific directions. No one knows exactly where to begin looking. And so, without Seti to guide them, her final secret may be one that is lost to time. Her story leaves us with so many questions. Without any logical, rational explanation for her knowledge, for her ability to pinpoint lost gardens and secret tunnels, even skeptics are left to wonder. Was she a brilliant hoaxer who somehow found lost information that no one else could? Or was Dorothy Eady, the little girl from London, truly the reincarnation of a priestess from ancient Egypt? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the freezing cold night of the 8th of February, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan was sitting around a roaring fire. He was with a big group of men deep inside a valley in western Colorado. The men gathered around that fire, Israel included, were all gold prospectors. That meant they spent their lives traveling the western United States, always looking for that next big score of gold. But for the past several weeks, this particular group of prospectors had been completely trapped in this valley. A series of terrible winter storms had moved in one after another, and each time a new storm hit, it would dump up to 6 feet of fresh snow, making any kind of travel impossible. They were stuck. On this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire just enjoying the warmth of the flames and listening to the other men tell stories, one of his friends stood up. This friend was another gold prospector, and his name was Alfred Packer. Alfred stood up and basically started to pitch an idea to the whole group. He wanted them to come with him and leave the valley right now. Alfred told everyone that the weather was starting to turn. He argued that it wasn't as bad as it had been, that the snow was even starting to melt a little, and then he made a big promise. Alfred said he knew a pathway out of there, a route that would take them out of the valley in just 2 weeks. Not only that, but this path would lead them directly to Breckenridge, Colorado. Breckenridge was a place that was well known by every prospector in the region. It was famous for having lots and lots of gold. So Alfred was essentially telling them, this is a win-win situation. We can finally get out of here and we can get rich in the process. After Alfred finished his pitch, he sat back down. For a moment, everyone just stayed quiet. Israel kind of looked around the fire, watching the faces of the other men, trying to see if anyone was going to take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew that, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't really like Alfred. They often said he was lazy and difficult to be around. But Israel had a feeling that wasn't the real reason they didn't like his friend. He believed the real reason that other people didn't like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy. This meant that from time to time, he would have seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability on long, difficult journeys like this. On a trek through the mountains, the whole group really needs to be able to rely on every single person. Everyone needs to be able to pull their own weight. So, they were worried about a guy who at any given moment could just become kind of useless because he was in the middle of a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy didn't really matter all that much. He didn't see Alfred as some huge liability. In his eyes, Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. So, for him to stand up and make this pitch, it just felt like it was in keeping with who Alfred was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to blindly follow him and go along with this big plan. But he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing the pros and cons in his head, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire. He saw one of the other men, a really big guy, sitting there looking incredibly serious. And this big man was just shaking his head slowly back and forth as if to say, no, you guys can't seriously be considering leaving early. Then the big guy stood up. He held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically signaling for him to not say another word. Then this guy, while still looking directly at Alfred, spoke to the whole group. He said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And with that, the big guy just sat back down again. A tense silence fell over the entire group around the fire. Everyone just sat there, the only sound being the crackling of the flames. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different from everyone else sitting around that fire. His name was Ure, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabaguash band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Ore had, in fact, saved the lives of every single person sitting around that fire, Israel and Alfred included. Just a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up completely lost in this very valley, which was the valley where Chief Ore lived with his tribe. He had found them stumbling around in the snow on the absolute brink of death as the storms raged. So, Chief Ore and his people had brought the prospectors food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river. And then Chief Ore gave them some simple advice. He told them to stay put in this campsite and just ride out the winter. Then, in the springtime, when all the snow melts, it would be safe for all of them to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were nothing but thankful. They were just totally thrilled that Chief Ore had found them and given them this campsite. It was a lifeline. And so, they had no problem at all agreeing to wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being more or less trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried that if they didn't leave soon, all the good spots would be taken and there would be no more gold left for them to mine. For Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold. He had told his family back home that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. This was his final shot. So, he really couldn't afford to go home empty-handed. He literally needed to find gold in order to continue to survive and to take care of his family. So, when Alfred stood up again and broke that tense silence, he spoke directly to Chief Ore. He said, "Thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early, and I just hope others will come with me." At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred's eyes. And Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. So, Israel spoke up. He said, "You know what? I'll go with you as well." And then, after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Ore could tell that he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. So, even though he felt like this was a truly terrible idea, he shifted his focus. He went from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were about to go into. So he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him. Then Chief Ore knelt down and drew a map in the dirt on the ground. He told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that they had to follow the river out of the valley. He explained that it would bring them to a mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range. And he was very clear. He told them, "You cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You have to follow that river and go around the mountain range." He said that once they did that on the other side, there would be an outpost where they could stop, get supplies, rest up, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then, after Chief Ore had explained all of this, he made sure to mark a big X on his dirt map, showing them exactly where that outpost would be. And with that, Chief Ore just turned around, walked over to his horse, and rode away. Shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night, their minds made up. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they all got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors, a man who had not volunteered to go with them and who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward. He said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go using his horse. But at some point, he would have to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. The men were very thankful for this offer. And so, shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go. They said their goodbyes, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they started to see it off in the distance. The huge, jagged peaks of the San Juan mountain range. But they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path that Chief Ore had told them about, because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. As Israel trudged through the deep snow in a single file line of men, he held on tightly to a metal coffee pot. Inside this pot, he kept hot coals from the fire. This was a little trick he had learned over the years. Not only did it keep his hands warm in the brutal cold, but also, if he ever ran out of matches, he could easily start a new fire using the coals. It was a simple but effective tool for survival. And so, as he's clutching this wonderfully warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him. He turned around and saw it was Alfred. And Alfred looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel felt. And so, without even thinking about it, Israel just handed his warm coffee pot off to Alfred. Alfred took it and clutched it to his chest, and his face showed obvious relief and thankfulness. Now, none of these gold prospectors had ever struck it rich. They were all basically poor men chasing a dream. But of all of them, Alfred really had the least. He had almost nothing to his name. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. There was also the age difference. Alfred was 30 years old, which was half the age of Israel. So Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid who was just trying to find his way in the world. Alfred had also confided in Israel about his past. He told him that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions. He wanted to fight against the slave-holding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they had kicked Alfred out because of his epilepsy. But that hadn't stopped Alfred from getting a tattoo on his arm with his battalion information and his name. Unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he had misspelled his own name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so, when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D, and from that point on, that was what people called him. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And this was kind of a source of embarrassment for him. And then, after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of just bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down anywhere and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help, a little bit of kindness. So, after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flask with some alcohol in it. He handed it to Israel almost as a silent thank you for giving him the warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing the flask and the coffee pot back and forth between them. By late afternoon that day, the snow was really starting to come down hard again. The prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he finally reached a point where he had to stop. He said his horse just couldn't go any farther, the weather was getting too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies in the snow, wished them luck, and then he turned his horse around and headed back down the trail toward the valley. And it's very likely that as these 6 men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the exact same thought. I just have to suck it up for 2 weeks, get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become rich. 2 weeks passed by. And Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Array had pointed out. The one that was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was supposed to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by. And still, they did not show up at the outpost. And they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas either. They had simply vanished. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving slightly. It was snowing less. But within just a couple of days of this group setting off on their trip, those brutal winter storms came back with a vengeance. They just dumped incredible amounts of snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey were the men themselves, and also Chief Ouray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay behind in the valley until spring. But even if Chief Ouray and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in serious trouble, there was nothing they could do. They would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley themselves and basically couldn't do anything. And so, in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other four men were totally lost somewhere out in the wilderness, but nobody even knew they were missing. But that would all change on the 16th of April, 1874. This was roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost, the same one that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast inside one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open. These officials, they all turn around and they see a man standing in the doorway. He was a totally disheveled-looking guy with long, matted hair that was sticking up in the air and a huge, bushy beard. In one hand, he was holding a rifle, and in the other hand, he was clutching a metal coffee pot. His eyes were darting like crazy from side to side, and he was clearly in a state of shock. He was trying to speak, but he just couldn't get any words out. This man was Alfred Packer. And it was obvious to the officials that this man was in dire need of help. And so, without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door against the cold, got him some food, and got him some water. Immediately, Alfred started wolfing down the food as fast as he could until he began vomiting. At which point, he apologized profusely to the men. He said, "I've been starving out in the wild for weeks. It must have done something to my intestinal tract. It's probably damaged." But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over their floor. They were just worried that this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put him in some warm, dry clothes. Then Alfred asked them if they had any whiskey. He said he wanted to kind of warm his body up from the inside. They said no problem, and they handed him some whiskey. Alfred threw a couple of shots back, and after that, it was pretty obvious that he had kind of relaxed a little bit. And at that point, one of the officials finally asked Alfred the question that was on all of their minds. "What happened to you?" As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials his story. He said that he had been with 5 other men, and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, a huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the path they were on. And so, the group made a fateful decision. They decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range, the one thing Chief Ouray had specifically told them not to do. He had said, "Do not go over the mountains." They decided to do that anyway. But as they were trying to traverse these treacherous mountains, it became clear that Alfred just was not keeping up with the rest of the group. And so, he said, they made the decision to leave him behind. To leave him behind to die. He knew he was being abandoned, and he had to watch as his 5 friends disappeared into the blowing snow. But amazingly, Alfred told them he did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months just stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going. He survived by eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the one thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was that when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. The one Israel had given him, and so at night he was able to start fires to stay warm. He also told them that at one point he was so hungry that he had cooked his own leather shoes in the fire and ate them. Because again, this guy was starving. And so really he was on the brink of death when he just randomly stumbled into this outpost and found their cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent, and Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, "Have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive?" And they would have to tell him, "No, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else." Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away. mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It had been 2 months since they had started that journey. The chances were just not good that they had survived the harsh winter in the mountains. But even if these other men were somehow not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to even begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search party because he's the only one who knows where they could possibly be. But Alfred was in no condition to go back out into the wild and lead a search. He was not healthy enough. And so, for several weeks, Alfred just stayed at the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so, it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On the 20th of August, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado. He was roughly in the same area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible, horrible smell. And so, John followed the smell until it brought him to a clearing. And in the clearing was what looked like an old, beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who might be in this campsite. But when he turned a corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze. Because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men, all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in complete shock from what he was seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether. And the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically just skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lifelike that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, but he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies. And when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chests, looked surgical. Like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not the result of random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away were the remains of a burned-out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods. And he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there. But it had all the signs of someone living there for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together in his mind, and John realized what he had just stumbled upon. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered. And the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or maybe even months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This was a cannibal's camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so, kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook he carried with him, he quickly sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out that John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was supposedly left behind to die, those 5 other men didn't carry on into the night. Somebody attacked them, began killing them, and then eating them. And that person was Alfred Packer. That was why Alfred had survived for so long out in the wilderness. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night. It was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even exactly when he killed them. All we know is that based on the investigation of the scene, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered. But the 5th victim, who was actually Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was in self-defense, and that somebody else killed the other 4. His story was kind of confusing despite those claims. There was one thing Alfred never denied, and that was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. When they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But, despite it being right there, a fresh source of food, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that instead. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 59 years old, he was granted parole. And right away, Alfred became a vegetarian. He died a few years later, taking the full story of what truly happened in those mountains to his grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Michael DiPolito grew up in a place that was tough by any standard. We're talking about a rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia. This was the kind of place where things like violence, drugs, and prostitution weren't shocking events you saw on the news. They were just part of the background noise of everyday life. And like a lot of kids in that environment, Michael got pulled into it early. His parents were alcoholics, and soon so was he. It didn't stop there. He developed a serious drug addiction, and to pay for it, he started selling drugs himself. School just wasn't a priority for him. He eventually dropped out of high school, and it wasn't long after that he found himself with nowhere to go. He became homeless, living out on the streets of the city he grew up in. At night, he'd find abandoned buildings to sleep in, just trying to stay warm and get through to the next day. In 1993, while he was still in this situation in South Philadelphia, the law caught up with him for the first time. He was arrested and charged with possession of an unknown drug, as well as the intent to sell it. The court records don't say what the drug was, but it didn't really matter. Michael was given a court date, and he just didn't show up. A warrant was put out for his arrest. Somehow, Michael managed to stay off the radar. He evaded the police for years. By 1997, he decided he needed a complete change of scenery. He fled South Philly and made his way down to South Florida, landing in a town called Boca Raton. But his old life had a way of following him. Shortly after he arrived, he was arrested for a second time. This time, he had offered an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. He pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution, but he was released not long after. A year after that arrest, his past came knocking again. A former girlfriend named Karen Tan sued him. She claimed he was the father of her son and that he owed her child support. Karen wasn't just making it up, she had a DNA test to prove it. But, just like with his drug charge, Michael simply didn't show up for court. After a while, Karen must have realized it was a losing battle and she gave up and dropped the lawsuit. For Michael, this was probably a huge relief. At the time, he was working through a temp agency, making barely any money. He knew he couldn't afford child support. So after that lawsuit was dropped, Michael decided he needed to find a way to make some real money. And in his search for a better opportunity, he somehow crossed paths with associates of the Bonanno crime family. Now, the Bonanno family is one of the 5 infamous families that dominate organized crime in the United States. They are, quite literally, the Italian mafia. When they met Michael, they saw something in him. He was charismatic, a natural talker. They liked him. And they offered him a job, an illegal one, but a very lucrative one. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room isn't a literal room with a boiler. It's a place where a group of fraudsters work the phones using high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from people. The way it usually works is a fraudster will cold call someone, maybe an elderly person, and tell them about this incredible get-rich-quick investment opportunity. But they'd always say, you have to invest right now or you'll miss out. When the unsuspecting victim agrees and wires over their money, the fraudster just keeps it. Michael turned out to be incredibly good at this. He was a natural salesman and he could trick people into giving him their money with ease. And so it didn't take long for him to realize he could make a lot more if he wasn't just an employee. He wanted to be the boss. He figured if he started his own boiler room, his commission on the money he stole could be much, much higher. So, pretty abruptly, he left the mafia's operation. We don't really know how the Bonanno family reacted to one of their guys just up and leaving to start a competing scam. Michael went on to set up not 1, but 2 of his own boiler room scams right there in South Florida. By 2002, he had managed to steal $155,000, but he had spent almost all of it. He lived a lavish lifestyle of fancy hotels, expensive cars, and phone sex lines. The good times, however, were not going to last. In 2002, the police finally caught on to Michael's scams. They raided both of his boiler rooms, and Michael was arrested for a 3rd time. And this time, he didn't skip his court date. He stood trial, was found guilty, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison and an incredible 28 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay back every single cent of the $155,000 he had stolen. Michael would only end up serving 7 months of his 2-year sentence, but those 7 months changed him forever. He absolutely hated prison. He hated every single second of it. During the long, sleepless nights he spent lying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself. He swore that when he got out, when he was finally released, he would never, ever come back. And so, when he was released in 2003, he was a man on a mission. The first thing he did was enter a sobriety program. He started going to the gym every single morning, getting his body and mind right. He also started studying for his GED. That's a high school equivalency test because remember, he had never gotten his high school diploma. A couple of months later, he passed the test and earned his GED. Then, he started a legitimate business. It was a digital marketing firm he called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael did his absolute best to stay on the straight and narrow. He focused on his sobriety, his health, and his business. And for the most part, he succeeded. By 2008, he was still sober, though he'd had a few setbacks along the way. His business, Mad Money Inc., was doing very well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his personal life was about to get very messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend, Maria Luongo. Maria had stood by him through everything, including his time in jail. But that year, in 2008, Michael, who was now 38 years old, cheated on her. He met a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Muhammad at a Starbucks. What was probably intended to be a quick, meaningless fling turned into something more. Michael and Dahlia fell in love, and they fell hard. Once Michael knew his feelings were real, he went to his wife Maria and told her everything. He told her he was in love with someone else and he wanted a divorce. Just 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Michael and Dahlia went down to the courthouse and got married. The newlyweds moved into a brand new condo that Michael had bought for them in Boynton Beach, a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a little while, their life seemed perfect. They knew the way they got together was outrageous, meeting and marrying so quickly, but they didn't care. They got along great and were excited to start their future together. But that perfect life was not going to last. On the evening of the 12th of March, 2009, only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dahlia were at home in their condo. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the front door. Michael went to see who it was. He opened the door, and to his complete surprise, his probation officer was standing on his doorstep. And behind the probation officer was a whole group of police officers. Before Michael could even ask what was going on, his probation officer told him that they had received an anonymous phone call. The caller had tipped them off that Michael was selling steroids, ecstasy pills, and other drugs out of his condo. Michael was stunned. He told the probation officer there was no way that was true. He insisted he wasn't selling any drugs. He was sober. He wasn't involved in that life anymore. Eventually, seeing that they were serious, Michael just stepped aside. He said, "Please, come in. Search my condo. I have nothing to hide." So, that's what they did. The police came inside and searched the entire place. But just as Michael had said, they didn't find anything. And so, they left. After the police were gone, Michael and Dahlia just stood there in their condo, completely dumbfounded. What just happened? Who would make a call like that? But instead of trying to figure it all out right then and there, they decided the best thing to do was just to get out of the condo for the night. They packed a couple of bags, left their home, which was a total mess from the police search, and went to stay at a nice hotel. They tried to put the strange event behind them and just have a nice night together. The next morning, they got up and headed down to the hotel parking lot. As they were walking toward their car, they saw a familiar sight. Standing around Michael's car was his probation officer, along with several other police officers. Michael and Dahlia looked at each other in disbelief. What is going on? They rushed over to the car, and before they could even start pleading their innocence, Michael's probation officer held up a hand. He told Michael that they had received another anonymous call. This time, the caller said that Michael was selling drugs out of his vehicle and they needed to search it. Michael was just beside himself. He couldn't believe this was happening again. But what could he do? He told them to go ahead and search the car. He said there was nothing in there. And so, the police opened up his car and tore it apart, looking for anything illegal. And once again, they found nothing. Over the next couple of weeks, this was the only thing Michael and Dahlia could talk about. Who was making these anonymous calls? Why was someone claiming Michael was selling drugs from his condo and his car? It just didn't make any sense. They wanted to believe it was all just some big, crazy mistake. But, in the back of their minds, they both knew about Michael's very checkered past. They thought about his dealings with the mafia and all the people he had ripped off in his boiler room scams. They started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, someone from his past was looking for revenge, trying to get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th. This was 17 days after that first raid on their condo. That night, Michael and Dahlia had been out to dinner at a restaurant. When they left and walked out to the parking lot, they were met with the same unbelievable scene. Standing around Michael's car were several police officers, clearly waiting for him. This time, they didn't even need to ask why the police were there. Michael and Dahlia walked over to them and just started pleading. They told the officers that this had to be a setup. They insisted they didn't have any drugs in the car. They begged the police to understand that someone was doing this to them. But this time, when the police searched his car, they would find something. After a thorough search of Michael's car, the police found a small bag of cocaine. It was stuck inside of a cigarette carton, which was tucked away underneath the spare tire in the trunk. When Michael saw the officer pull the bag of cocaine out, he just broke down. He started to cry. He knew, even though the drugs were not his, and even though he hadn't put them there, that he was going to jail. He was on probation. A possession charge would be a clear violation, and he would be sent right back to prison. He just stood there crying, pleading with the police, swearing that the cocaine was not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia was watching all of this unfold. And for a moment, she started to second-guess everything. Was Michael lying? Was he actually selling drugs and had been lying to her this whole time? But then she looked at her husband. He was crying hysterically, and he looked so sincere, so genuinely terrified. And in that moment, she decided she believed him. She was convinced he had to be telling the truth. So pretty soon, she was standing right there beside Michael, also pleading with the police. She told them to let him go, that this was obviously a setup. Amazingly, the police officers seemed to be listening. They were already aware of the 2 previous false tip-offs about Michael. They told Michael and Dahlia that they did think the situation was pretty suspicious. Someone keeps calling in about you selling drugs, and now, suddenly, drugs magically appear in your car. It seemed too convenient. So, the officers told them what they were going to do. They said they were going to confiscate the cocaine, but they were not going to arrest Michael. They told them to go home, be safe, and to call them immediately if they saw or heard anything strange. And they promised they would start an investigation to figure out who was making all of these anonymous calls. Michael and Dahlia were so relieved they could hardly believe it. But at the same time, they were also terrified. It was clear now that whoever was trying to get Michael in trouble was willing to break into his property to do it. What was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs there too? After the police left, Michael and Dahlia jumped in their car and sped back to their condo. They went inside and searched the entire place from top to bottom. They were looking for any sign that someone had recently been inside, or for any more drugs or anything else illegal that might have been planted. After a long search, they found nothing. So they locked all their doors, shut all their windows, closed all the blinds, and just prayed. They prayed that the police would be able to quickly find out who was doing this to them and make it stop. But over the next few months, the police didn't figure out who the anonymous caller was. And that was because the caller had stopped calling. The phone calls just ended. And for a little while, Michael and Dahlia started to believe that the whole terrifying ordeal was finally over. They slowly returned to their normal lives. But on the 5th of August 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine had been found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning, at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo. Michael was still in bed, asleep. She headed out to her local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 inches the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and checked her phone. She saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. The number had also left her a voicemail. So, she called her voicemail and put the phone to her ear. As she listened to the message, her heart started to race. It was a Boynton Beach detective. He was telling her that there had been some sort of incident at her condo and that she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and ran out of the gym. She got into her car and immediately called the number back. When the detective picked up, she tried to get more information out of him. What kind of incident? What happened? But the detective would only say that it involved her husband, Michael, and that he would explain everything when she got back to the condo. In a total state of shock, Dahlia started her car, sped out of the parking lot, and headed home. When she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she slammed on the brakes. The entire area was a chaotic scene. In front of her condo were multiple police cars, their lights flashing. Police officers were walking all around the property. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front of her home. And inside that taped-off area, there were crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. As Dahlia sat there in her car at the end of the street, just staring at this unbelievable scene, one of the Boynton Beach police officers saw her. He walked up to her car, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he told her to leave her car right where it was and to come with him. Dahlia knew, obviously, that something terrible had happened, but she still didn't know exactly what. She put her car in park, got out, and began walking with the police officer. He led her toward a small group of 3 people who were standing right in front of her property. It turned out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. As soon as that detective saw Dahlia approaching, he walked over to her. And then, very matter-of-factly, he told her that someone had called in a disturbance at their condo. He said that shots were fired, and unfortunately, her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia became totally hysterical. An officer gently led her away from the scene and into a nearby police car. They drove her to the police station, sat her down in an interrogation room, and began asking her questions about her husband. The detective said to her, "Look, I know you just found this out, but we have to figure out what happened. There's a killer on the loose, and we need to find this person and stop them." At first, the conversation was mostly just Dahlia crying while the detective tried to calm her down, but eventually she started talking. She told the detective all about the anonymous caller who kept phoning the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs. She told him how she and Michael suspected that the caller was probably connected to someone from his past. Maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims from his boiler room scams. She said it could be any number of people that Michael had wronged over the years. The detective took diligent notes, listening patiently to everything Dahlia said. Then, during a break in the conversation, he looked at her and said, "Okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy." Dahlia, who had been looking down at the table, looked up, confused about what he was talking about, and then the door to the interrogation room opened. A huge man in handcuffs walked into the room. An officer was yelling, "Come here! Bring this guy in here!" "Get over here." "Do you know who this guy is?" Dahlia looked at the man and said, "Never seen him before." The officer asked the man, "Do you know her?" The man looked at Dahlia. An officer said, "Put your head up and look at her." The man said, "I've never seen her before." The officer then asked him, "What were you doing coming out of her house?" Then he ordered for the man to be taken out of the room. It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She knew exactly who that man was. The truth was, almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her. She wanted the rest of his money, and she wanted his condo too. So, she had been the anonymous caller all along. She was the one who kept calling the police, tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the bag of cocaine in the back of his car. She wanted him to get arrested because she knew that since he was on probation, he would go back to jail for a really long time and she would get everything. But when her efforts failed and Michael didn't get arrested and sent back to jail, Dahlia moved on to Plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and asked him a chilling question. She asked him if he knew any hitmen that could murder her husband. At first, the ex-boyfriend didn't think she was serious, but she kept asking him about it. She started offering to pay for it. She was making it very clear that she wasn't joking around. So the ex-boyfriend basically told her no, he didn't know any hitmen. And then he hung up the phone and called the Boynton Beach Police Department. He told them everything about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill her husband, Michael. When the police found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman. They set up a meeting with Dahlia. That undercover agent was the huge guy in handcuffs who was just led into the interrogation room with her. Dahlia had gone to meet this fake hitman. She got into his car, and there was a hidden camera in the back seat filming her the entire time. She was caught on camera saying she wanted to kill her husband. She gave money to the undercover agent as a down payment. Then, just as she was about to get out of the car, the agent turned to her. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave this car, it's done. I am going to kill Michael, and you can't stop it." Dahlia's reaction was captured on film. She said, "It's not changing. No." There's no positive 5,000% sure. She went on to say, "No, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. As soon as he told me about getting the money from you, I went and I grabbed it right away. We were good to go. With me, you're not going to have a problem. You're not going to have an issue." So, the Boynton Beach Police Department now had all this information. They knew exactly what Dahlia thought was going to happen. And they decided they could use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And as it just so happened, the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area at that time. So the police department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. They got to film everything. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. She headed to the gym, believing in her mind that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after she left. She thought he would break in and shoot her husband twice in the head because that was the plan they had agreed on, the plan that was captured on film. As soon as the police who were monitoring the condo saw her leave, they rushed in. They knocked on the door and got Michael to come downstairs. Michael had absolutely no idea that his wife was trying to have him killed. He came to the door, totally confused, but he went with the officers. They ushered him off to the police station for his safety. Then, for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right in front of the condo. Once everything was in place, that's when the detective called Dahlia and left her that voicemail saying there had been an incident and she needed to come back. A couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called him back and said she was on her way, that's when the TV crews for the Cops show set up their cameras in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next. The detective's words to her were recorded. "Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house and there were shots fired." Dahlia asked, "Is your husband Michael okay?" And the detective delivered the line, "I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, he's been killed." Back in the interrogation room, after the fake hitman was pulled out and Dahlia had denied knowing him, the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news. He told her he knew all about her murder-for-hire plot and that she was going to jail. He told her, "You're under arrest." That's an undercover police officer. "Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in front of CBS." She started to deny it, saying, "I didn't do anything." The detective cut her off. "You're going to jail. Don't tell me you didn't do anything. You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're going to come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail. We're going to book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive." Dahlia's response was a disbelieving, "Oh, yes. Thank God." The detective continued, "Thank God. He doesn't want to see you." After Dahlia was arrested, while she was still sitting in that interrogation room, the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking her husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Her reaction was caught on tape. "Oh my God, he's alive! Come here, please. Come here, please. Come here. Come here, please. Come here." "Why not?" "I heard you, Mike. Come here, please. Come here." Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done. But after a retrial, which was granted because of jury bias in her first trial, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.